So I want to kind of go back to Malthus and his original problem of excess population, and return to the country I mentioned at the beginning, India, a country that clearly many people think has a population problem, and I kind of want to go back into why people thought that is. Now, Malthus' explanation is been very influential. You hear it even people who don't know who Malthus is use his arguments all the time. Anytime people say, "Oh my gosh, there's this huge train wreck in the future and we have to stop it," environmental problems. Oh my gosh, we have so much pollution, it's going to lead to global warming, destroy the environment, use up all the resources, etc. Or economic crisis. Oh, we have so much debt. How can we ever pay this debt off? It's just going to fall on top of us. Future generations, you're never going to be able to pay off the national credit card. Okay, so these arguments are made all the time, and all of them go back intellectually to Malthus' argument that you're going to have some imbalance, and eventually this imbalance is going to be like a car going too fast and hit a wall, and it's going to be very ugly when it happens. Well, let's look at India, because if Malthus is right, India should have a major population problem. And since independence in the late 1940s, India's population has gone up more than double. It's gone from about 400 million to over 1 billion. Now, even bigger problem. India has only 2.5% of the world's land, but it has 15% of the world's people, which means its population density is 6 times more than the average population density in the Earth, which means they have even fewer resources. You might think of 6 times fewer resources to support its population than a typical average country in the world, which means that if there's a Malthus problem, they should have it, because their ability to increase their food supply domestically is relatively limited, because you have a lot of people and not a lot of land to support that number of people. On top of it, as we were saying, the population pyramids, things of that sort, 35%, or just like Japan in 1950, of its population is under 15, which means 1/3 of their current population, 1/3 of that 1 billion people, haven't had children yet. And they are going to have children because they're going to grow up and have their 20s and want to get married and want to have children, which means that there's a big kind of, let's say, momentum that's going to drive even future population growth, even if not one more child is born after today. On top of that, 70% of their population is rural. They live in the countryside on farms. This might be a little bit less today, but it's roughly in that range, which means you're going to want to have more children, because if you're an agricultural society, you want children because you can put them to work. So there's a strong incentive at the household level to not have fewer children, but to have more. So instead not have 1 child or 2 children, but to have 5 or 6 children. On top of that, 1/3 of the population is illiterate, which means 1 out of every 3 people can't read or write, which means they probably don't understand the principles of safe sex, population control, and managing their reproductive and how many children they're going to have, which means that there's very little. The thing that really drives the demographic transition is women figuring out that maybe they don't want to have 10 children. Much less likely that this epiphany is going to happen for Indian women. So back in the 1960s and 1970s, when all this data was pretty much self-evident, I could look at the numbers and say, well, geez, it looks like India's in for a really bad population crisis. And many people said, well, we have to have draconian measures. We need a one-child policy. We need to let the poor Indians die. Don't give them extra food. Don't send them aid from the United States, because if you give them free food in the United States, they're just going to want more of it, and they're not going to learn how to grow it themselves, and they're going to get dependent on handouts, things, blah, 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 blah. Basically, Thomas Malthus reincarnated. And since its independence, India's had many droughts. They've had many times where they've had bad harvests. There's many times where there wasn't enough food. But a strange thing happened. Since 1945, or I should say since 1949, when India roughly became independent, there's never been a famine. That means there hasn't been this time where millions of people have died off because they can't find enough food. Now, it's not because India's ability to grow food India's had a lot of problems. They have had major droughts where the amount of food they can produce has gone down dramatically. And this is strange because if you look at India's history, there have been many famines. There was the Great Bengal famine during World War II, where 3 million people died from lack of food because the Japanese waged warfare against the civilians by destroying the irrigation and their ability to grow food. And there were many different famines under British rule and under previous imperial rule in India. But all of a sudden, in the last 60 years, there hasn't been a famine. Now, mind you, in countries that produce even better food and are more advanced than India, like China, you've had massive famines. After the Great Leap Forward, you had a famine in China that killed, estimated, between 20 and 30 million people. That's 20 or 30 million people in a few years died from hunger. That's about as many people that died in World War I and about half the number that died in World War II. Just from hunger in China, one famine. And there were many different famines in China, not to mention the famines that happened in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan, Darfur. We've had equally severe die-off. Well, not quite as severe as China, but pretty severe die-offs. So how has India been able to avoid these famines? How have they been able to avoid the Malthusian outcome where there's not enough food? And here we have to look at what did Malthus get wrong. Now remember, Malthus is writing in 1798. A lot of things haven't happened yet. So basically I think that Malthus got 4 basic things wrong. The first one was technology. Malthus did not fully appreciate that improvements in technology would actually improve productivity. He probably underestimated our ability to discover new seeds, new fertilizers, what we collectively call the Green Revolution, that we would be able to produce a lot more food. And on top of that, we would learn new techniques, new plows, genetically modified animals that could produce more food, breeding that meant that you had animals that would have more meat on them, etc., etc., etc. We actually would be able to up our food production. At least so that maybe there was a Malthusian problem sometime in the future, but it was a lot more distant in the future than Thomas Malthus had anticipated. Second one is trade. And at Malthus's time, 1798, 1800, there wasn't a lot of international trade. Most, particularly for foodstuffs and things we would eat, you got them locally. So Malthus did not understand international trade. It was a minor part of the economy. It was mostly in luxury goods. But what international trade has allowed is that there might be a famine in one place, but there's not going to be a famine everywhere at the same time. So the point is that there might be a famine in Iowa, but there's not going to be a famine in Ukraine, and therefore when there's a famine in Iowa, you can buy food from Ukraine and send it to Iowa. And what international trade would do is that when people had famines, the price for food would go up, and this, through the market mechanism, would attract food to be sold to those countries. Not only that, more people might decide to become farmers and produce more food than they would in the past. So that's the second thing that I don't think Malthus quite got right. The third thing was democracy. 1798, you basically have one democracy, and a tentative one at that, in the world, and that was the United States. Malthus was mostly living in a very hierarchical society where nobles could basically feed themselves on large meals, think Oliver Twist, and everyone else would probably starve. But democracy is actually, I think, explains the difference between China and India. China is not a democracy. China is a party-ruled communist government. If you want to put a nice spin on it, it's a technocratic government, a government by experts. There's not really elections for most officials. India has always been a democracy. Now, when you have a democracy, it's kind of, let's say, prevents disasters from happening, because it makes sure, in a functioning democracy, it makes sure that everyone is treated equitably, which means that if there's a shortage of food, we don't have the situation where some people get a full meal and other people get nothing. Everyone maybe gets half a meal, which means everyone might be undernourished in a democracy in relation to, let's say, a food shortage, but no one starves. No one gets a situation where they're getting so few calories that they will actually die from their lack of calories. Everyone basically tightens their belts equally, and everyone shares the burden and shares the cost. And the stronger your democracy is, and India is a very strong democracy, there's a lot of institutions that when there's a famine or when there's a threat of a famine, the government kicks in gear and uses its resources to make sure that those who are poorly off at least have the basic supports, the basic sustenance to maintain their lifestyle. And the last thing that Malthus got wrong is that I think he misinterpreted the data. And this is something we understand more now because we have a lot better data on famines and malnourishment and things of that sort. And that famines are actually more likely when food production is high, not when food production is low. And I just want to show you a chart. Okay, we had a little bit of a technical problem here, so I'm re-recording the dialogue for this slide. And this shows you the data about grain production and grain imports in India since 1960 to the late 1980s. And so on the top line, you have the solid line showing grain production. As you can see, it goes up and down, up and down. When it goes down, that's basically a famine. The ability to produce grain decreases. Okay. And here you have this broken line on the bottom which shows imports. Obviously, when you don't produce as much grain domestically, imports go up because you bring grain from other countries. This was the trade idea I talked about in the previous slide. But what you also get here is this rubber band effect, which means that when grain production goes down, what happens in the following year is that it actually bounces up to a higher level than it was before. Because what happens when you have a market economy, the decrease in the production of grain makes grain expensive. Meaning it commands a higher price. Because it commands a higher price, guess what happens? More people have an incentive to find out ways to produce grain more productively. More people decide to become farmers. And so what you see is the following year, you actually get a bump up in grain. So after 1966, you see a bump up in grain production. After 1975, you see a bump up in grain production. And so what you're basically seeing is the realization of the promise of the Green Revolution. But what really stems it is the high prices of grain that occur from famines because of the shortages, spurring more and more people to kind of think about or implement policies that are more productive than they would be in the past. And this is probably what Malthus did not realize. So if you think back to that very first graph about food production, it had decreasing returns to scale. The food production was leveling off or decreasing. But as you can see, the real data showed that grain production has basically gone up and up and up over time. And if you drew this line out even further, it would keep going up. Which means that, in fact, despite what Malthus thought about decreasing returns to scale, we've actually seen that innovation has been spurred by the existence of shortages. Those shortages, or as some people would say, necessity, became the mother of invention. So I'm going to end it here. I hope you kind of looked at scarcity from a bunch of different lenses, and we have a way to talk about it and understand how it creates incentives in the system, how it kind of forms both social, political, and economic behavior. And next time we will be talking about starting an introduction to game theory. So thank you for listening, and have a good day.